It's Tuesday, February 11th. This is a joint hearing of the House and Senate Education Committees. We're welcoming today folks from the Education Council of the States to do what they do best, and that is to tell us how things go outside Vermont and kind of give us some state-by-state comparisons. The topic today is state-level oversight, and this is really looking at the issue of an agency versus a department, a secretary that is appointed by the governor versus a commissioner that is directed by a state board of education. Vermont, we have made that transition, but still retain vestiges of the old system. So we thought it would be a good time to take a look at what we've had and what we hope to have. Anyway, we're going to turn it over to Joel and company to introduce yourselves and give us your presentation.
Great. Thank you all so much. Are you able to see my slides?
Perfect.
Great. Good. Thank you so much for having us today. Again, my name is Joel Moore. I am the Director of State Relations with Education Commission of the States, and also have the privilege of serving as ECS's liaison to the policymakers in Vermont. Happy to be your go-to person, rather, with any questions you might have, and it's always my job to get y'all to the right resources within ECS. We haven't spoken with the Senate this year, so very briefly as an introduction for those who may not be familiar with Education Commission of the States, we were founded about 60 years ago through the Interstate Compact for Education as a national, nonpartisan, and non-advocacy education policy center, created with the purpose of helping states exchange ideas and learn from one another's experiences. As an interstate compact, we were created in law by all 50 states, the DC and the territories, and we're unique from our peers in a couple of ways in that we work across the entire education spectrum from early learning through post-secondary, and also that we work with all education policymakers in the state, whether it's you all as legislators, state departments, governor's offices, or offices of higher ed or early ed or state boards. Again, we're nonpartisan, non-advocacy. We don't tell you what's right for Vermont or your students. You know your state and its families and its context the best, but we can tell you what the rest of the country is doing and what that looks like for them. A bit about how we do it. Our amazing policy team is tracking and reviewing every piece of educator-related legislation that's coming out of the country. It's about 7,500 bills last year. We're also looking at things like state of the state addresses, executive orders, State Department priorities to inform our policy research and publications. All of the resources that we publish are available for you for free on our website, ecs.org, and I totally recognize that it's a lot of information, so always feel free to reach out directly to me with any questions you might have, and I'll get you to the right spot. And if there's anything that we don't have an immediate resource on, ask me, and I'll get our policy team to find an answer for you. We're usually able to do that. It's our information request process. We're usually able to get a written memo to you in about 72 hours. Last year, Zeke and team did about 500 of those, so always happy to help out however we can. Today's presentation will be based off of one of our 50 state comparisons. This one's on K-12 governance. This is available both on our website and I believe already linked on your committee's agenda page. In addition to that, I've also passed along a recent memo that looks at some recent legislative and state efforts to change governance structures. This is also a good example of our information request process. And there's also a link shared on there that share links to one of our partners resources at NASB. It's the National Association of State Boards of Education. They've created a really amazing, simple matrix of state education governance that's looking at things like how state board members are chosen, how the chief state school officer is chosen, term limits, lengths of terms and authorities, that sort of thing. So with that, I'll turn it over to Zeke, who is an assistant policy director with our team, to share a little bit more about the actors and landscape of K-12 governance nationally.
Thank you, Joel, and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for having us join you today. It's nice to join you virtually, and Vermont is pretty high on my bucket list of states to visit, so hopefully one of these days I can do a similar thing in person. But yeah, great to see you here virtually and excited to talk through what we've seen in K-12 governance. So we'll talk through the various roles and responsibilities in state governance today. And before I dive in, I do want to acknowledge that across all 50 states, we've seen 50 different ways of governing. And so even though today we'll go through and we'll combine those into some like buckets based on different key aspects and models, each state has its own unique background, spending, culture, political climate, and educational needs that impact the roles and the structures that we'll discuss today. So the roles that we'll discuss today are governors and voters, chief state school officers, state boards of education, and local boards of education. And while we won't go into as much detail in this presentation on the first two on the list, we do want to highlight the roles of both the governors and the electorate in education governance. Each of the models that we discuss today hinge on governor appointments or who is elected by voters. And so while we won't get into the education-related roles and duties each of those may have, we did want to note the impact that they have on education. And as Joel mentioned at the top, we're going to talk through a lot of numbers, a lot of high-level details, X number of states do this, Y do this. So as Joel said, right, as we get into some of these bigger, broader topics and then some state examples, if you do have any questions or specifics that you'd like, feel free to reach out and we can dig into those. But yeah, first up, we'll start here with chief state school officers. So the titles and roles that you might recognize for chief state school officers are state superintendents of education, commissioners of education, directors of departments of education, or secretaries of education. And want to look broadly about where each of those are housed. Right now, as of the latest update, 20 of those are appointed by state boards of education. 17 of those are appointed by the governor, as is the case in Vermont. 12 are elected. In one state, the chief state school officer is appointed by the state executive level secretary, which we'll get to here in a second. And uniquely in Oregon, the governor serves as the superintendent of education. So looking at the source of their authority and where they get their power from, 30 chief state school officers have a formal role written into the state constitution that allows them to serve in a variety of education governance roles. So some of those roles typically include efforts around the staffing and the organization of departments of education or of the public school system broadly in their state. And in many states, chief state school officers have the power of general supervision over all public schools within the state. So to split off here, we'll talk a little bit about those executive level secretaries I mentioned. And these are meant to include other formal education policy roles in state governance structures that relate to K-12 education policy. So in most cases, the chief state school officer serves as a secretary of education for the state board as well, with a formal role on the board. So for example, in Alabama, the state board appoints the superintendent of education, and then the superintendent then serves as the secretary of education and serves as the executive officer of the board as well. In other instances, in some states, the secretary of the board is an independent cabinet position. So among those states, in 3 states, the executive level secretary is appointed by the governor separately. But in most cases, the executive level secretary is a position on the state board by itself. So for one example of that, in New Hampshire, for the chief state school officer, the governor appoints the secretary of education. And then for the executive level position, the governor appoints separately a deputy commissioner of education. But to dive in a little bit here about some crossover for those roles, we have seen in some states that they do have an executive level secretary of education as well as a state superintendent. So to roll through a few examples there, Virginia has both a secretary of education and a state superintendent, both of which are appointed by the governor. The secretary of education serves in the governor's cabinet with an advisory role and coordinates across state agencies. And the governor consults with the state board in appointing the superintendent, who then leads the department and serves as the secretary for the board. Similarly, Massachusetts has both a secretary of education and a state superintendent of education. The governor appoints the secretary as a cabinet member with advisory and coordinating roles, and that secretary serves as the secretary to the state board as well. The state superintendent is recommended to the secretary by a 2/3 vote of all its members for the secretary's approval. And looking at a recent change, Ohio recently made major tweaks to its governance system, moving most of the functions of its Department of Education into a new cabinet-level Office of Education and Workforce, with the director there under the governor leading that work. So there, the state superintendent remains the head of the State Department of Education, which primarily administers teacher licensure. Next up, we'll dive into state boards of education. So looking at boards of ed and the membership.
I'm going to interrupt for a moment if I could. Could you,
Absolutely.
would you just distinguish for a moment the difference between a superintendent and a secretary?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in many states, those roles are alike. Looking at our 50-state comparison, there are some states where that secretary and the superintendent are one and the same. The roles for both are kind of, the secretary will do the roles prescribed as a secretary, as well as the roles prescribed as a superintendent. You have one individual doing both of those things. And then in those other states, those are split out into two separate roles. So, a little tricky in some state nuance with how those are split out. But across states, I'd say we see primarily one person serving in both roles, and then in a fewer number of states, those being split out.
Yeah, I would add to that that often the folks who have often it's largely a similar role with different titles, but the person in the secretary role usually has a more formal role with the State Board of Education.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of the use of the word secretary, and in some states, secretary is, they're the secretary of the state and secretary of a board, so it does get a little tricky in some states. But yeah, looking now at state boards of education, we'll start looking at the membership, specifically the number of voting members, and that varies pretty widely by state. Typically, the most common number of members that we see is 7 to 9 members. 7 is the lowest among states, although some territories do have 5. Some states have many more. So we have Pennsylvania with 21 voting members and Ohio with 19, but 7 to 9 is the most common range that we see. And we have seen a growing number of states recognize the role that students and teachers can play in education governance. So in 21 states in the District of Columbia, their board includes a student representative, and I know that's the case in Vermont. And in 12 states now, their Board of Education has teacher representation on the board, with 3 states including either the current or former Teacher of the Year. Next up, looking at how those board members are selected, typically either falls into governor appointment by another authority, or an elected board. So according to the latest from the National Association of State Boards of Education, which Joel mentioned, there are 35 states in which state boards are appointed. Vermont also falls into that category. So for those 35 states where the board members are appointed, in the majority of those, the governor appoints the board, either fully for all of the members on the board or in conjunction with some other selection. But in other states, different groups or individuals or agencies might play that role. So in other states, the legislature, the lieutenant governor, speaker of the House, the treasurer, or other bodies or individuals appoint the board members. In 15 states and some additional territories where some or all of the members of the board are appointed, they're appointed through election. In 10 of those 15 states, and again, sorry for all of the numbers, but in 10 of those 15, they have only elected members rather than a mix of elected and appointed, as is the case in those other 5. And again, within any of those given approaches, there's a lot of nuance. So in some states, the governor might make the appointments, but they might do so based on a select number of individuals that's put forward to them by the General Assembly. In other states, they make the appointments with the advice and consent of the Senate. There are a lot of nuance in how those appointments take place, whether that's done by the governor or another body. So to look at what these boards are in charge of, typically the main areas of policy authority that we see resting with boards is around teacher licensure or state standards. So in the majority of states, 33 states to be specific, the authority to oversee teacher licensure rests with the State Board of Education. In other states, that power might be left to the state education agency or to a professional standards commission. As for state standards, state boards of ed are primarily responsible for adopting standards in all but just a few states. Beyond that, roles and duties for state boards might include a variety of purposes, including setting state attainment goals, approving budgets for departments of education, aligning grad requirements with workforce readiness needs, or adopting courses of study and examining state curriculums. So next up, we'll talk a little bit about local boards of education. And these are, again, primarily the membership in some states is determined in state statute. In some cases, appointment is limited to the head of state of education and to higher education agencies. Eligibility varies by state, with some often parameters being around individuals serving only in districts that they might represent in those local districts, or requirements around the type of professional service an individual might have to be on the board. There's also requirements preventing people from holding a local board of education role as well as another role in the state simultaneously or in the district simultaneously. And powers and policy authority there. In some states, we do see statutory or constitutional authority for the state boards of education or for the chief state school officers, providing that they have some district authority, but in most cases, districts and those local boards of education are in charge of any of the schools within their purview. All right, next up, we'll talk about some of the state governance models we mentioned at the top. So once again, each of these states that we'll talk about are pretty widely different, but even so, we can group them into similar models based on different state structures. So today we'll talk through 4 common models of state governance, plus some additional examples that don't quite fit in here. And this map up front previews what those look like, kind of gives you an idea of how widespread the different models are used across the country. And, there's not really any regional commonalities between any of these models. It's very widespread across the US. So first up, model 1 is the appointed board, appointed chief model. In this model, voters elect the governor, who then appoints both members of the State Board of Education and the chief state school officer. As you know, Vermont follows this model, and these are highlighted here in the light purple. To give it a state example, Tennessee follows this approach. So the governor appoints members of the board. That's confirmed by the General Assembly. And then the commissioner of education is also appointed by the governor. Next up for model 2, this is the governor appointment and board appointment model. In this model, voters elect the governor, who then appoints either all or most of the members of the State Board of Education, depending on the state. The state board then in turn appoints the chief state school officer, and those are highlighted here in the dark green. For a state example for this one, West Virginia follows this model. So members are appointed by the governor, and then the state superintendent of schools is appointed by the State Board of Education and serves at the pleasure of the board. Next up, we'll look at model 3. This is the appointed board and elected chief model. So here, voters elect the governor and the chief state school officer, and then the governor appoints the State Board of Education members. These examples are highlighted here in the dark purple. In a state example for this one, Georgia, state board members are appointed by the governor with the advice and consent of the Senate, and then the state school superintendent is elected on a public ballot by the voters on a partisan ballot. And then finally, we have model 4, which is the elected board, and then the board appoints the chief model, catchy name. In this model, voters elect both the governor and the State Board of Education. The state board then appoints the chief state school officer. So these are highlighted here in orange. To use Colorado as an example for this one, the State Board of Education is elected through popular vote on a partisan ballot. And then the Commissioner of Education is appointed by that board and serves at the pleasure of the board. So finally, looking at the wide stretch of states that are highlighted there in the light green, we see 14 states that fall under the other umbrella. And these states incorporate pieces of other models with a mix of appointed and elected members for their boards or for the commissioners. So to summarize here and kind of take a step back and look at key takeaways, again, as we've mentioned before, there are 50 states, and with that, 50 different ways of governance. So even though they're bucketed into the different models here, Those unique characteristics of any given state really affect the specifics of selection, eligibility, the roles that they play, whether that's in the Constitution or in statute. As we talked about with executive level roles, that gets split out as well. So what we've heard across states, even though there's a wide variety of models, and even though we can bucket them to common models, we haven't heard from states that any one given model works better than others. But what we have heard is that regardless of the governance approach used or how power is split across the roles in the state, we've consistently heard that collaboration across the groups is key. And finally, we've heard that ensuring that student achievement, student success is placed at the forefront is important, and ensuring that measurables and achievable goals are set related to student achievement so that any efforts across any of these roles are aimed at that leads to the most effective and efficient governance across states. With that, we'll pause and take questions.
Great, thank you. You're speaking to two different committee rooms. And I think maybe if you could stop sharing your screen, we'll be able to see each other. That'd be great. Well, that's okay too. We'll stick with that.
Keep the baby. Keep the baby.
So cute.
Underneath it should say, your state Department of Education matters to me.
So somebody's going to need to stop sharing their screen for us to see each other. But if you really would like us to continue to look at this adorable baby, we can do that as well. We'll begin in the House Education.
I'm really
room.
trying, y'all. I apologize. There we go. There we go.
Could you talk a little bit about the tasks and duties of state boards? You mentioned only a few, and frankly, they weren't the roles that are probably the most powerful, such as rulemaking, setting of standards, that sort of thing. But particularly rulemaking, do you have any data as to how that divides between agencies, departments, and state boards?
Sorry, yes, we do. In the 50-state comparison that we passed along beforehand that's linked on the agenda page, one of the data points is the constitutional and statutory authority that each of the state boards has. As Zeke mentioned, it varies pretty widely between state boards. They can, the state board in Alaska, for example, has the authority to even determine and disperse, they make final decisions on school employee compensation and compensation for administrative officers, where, often in many other states, that's more at the local level. It really, really varies widely. I think that some of the more common places that everyone has authority are in teacher licensure generally, and in curriculum decisions. Zeke, do you have additional insight on that?
Sure, yeah. Just plus one that it varies widely. In some states, statute or constitution simply writes out that the board will serve as an advisory role to the chief state school officer. Some statute and constitution gets really granular about each of the roles that they can take, whether that's financing, whether that's being in charge of certain reports related to education, kind of just laying out a laundry list of approaches. Some are more broad and sweeping, giving them a broad general power over, any education matters and keeping it at that level. But yeah, it truly does vary pretty widely by state within any of those buckets.
I'll take a look at the document that you sent, but really, we often love to compare ourselves to other New England states or how other New England states operate. The other question I would have is, how many are sort of full-time professional boards, and how many are very part-time, almost uncompensated boards, and how are they staffed or funded?
That's a great question. We can follow up with do a quick memo for you on what your fellow New England states look like as far as all of the things you just mentioned. We'll get something written to you back soon.
Right, and I know I just keep asking questions where the answer is it's varied across the country and everybody does it a little differently, which is very obvious here. Other questions here in our committee? Senate Education, you're up. Any questions over there?
I don't think so, but those were good questions you asked. Thank you for asking them.
Thank you.
And I will briefly take a crack at that membership question and the full-time, part-time. Again, sorry, it does vary widely, so we'll get the details to you in comparisons to similar states. But just to take a crack at some pieces that we've seen, yeah, some states lay out term limits for those individuals, so that's one piece of it. Again, with boards ranging from anywhere from 7 members to 21, I think the roles in any given state might change, but yeah, certainly some states lay out term limits. Again, some states lay out kind of professional or other requirements, other standards that individuals might meet to be on the board, specifically for those more public members, students or teachers. So yeah, but yeah, we'll pull together some of those examples of the licensure required, how long they spent on a board, what other requirements are asked of them.
I'm just going to ask folks in our committee, does our state board, they don't get too involved in teacher licensure, do they?
No, that's all at the daily.
It's very interesting. That's a commonality across the country,
Yeah,
but we don't do that.
No, we does that.
Not seeing any other questions? Here, go right ahead. Representative Long.
I'll just ask quickly, the state of Vermont did make a change in 2012 from a commissioner of education to a secretary, elevated the position to a secretary, although in both cases they were appointed by the governor. But we've received testimony from the last commissioner of education who became the first secretary of education, and some of the feedback we got from him was the position became very, changed into a more political position than it was prior to that, because the relationship with the state board changed as well. So I'm just curious about any feedback you have on that from other states, or how that plays out elsewhere.
Do you want to go, Zeke?
Sure, I'll take the first crack. Yeah, so we have seen across states, some states assembled task forces related to education governance with some of those findings, and tried to look at most efficient uses of each role. So we can certainly look into those. I will say the examples are pretty limited. I think the most recent one was focused only on higher education governance. But yeah, we can look at what states have found there in terms of where they put certain roles or certain powers within. Certain powers within certain roles across the state. Yeah, Joel, do you have any thoughts about the political piece of those?
Sure. I mean, I just add, obviously, with any sort of appointment by an elected official, there is going to be some degree of politics behind it. I think it is also interesting and worthy of note that Vermont is in a relatively unique position on the national landscape, in that you have a legislature that is, and has for a little while now, been united on one side of the aisle with the governor across the aisle. There are actually only, I think, 6 states around the country in that position right now, or 7, other than you all. So it's a relatively unique political environment there. And of those, only it's you all, Virginia and Nevada, who have a legislature of one party with a governor of the opposite party, and the governor makes the appointment. You're looking at other states, Arizona, North Carolina, Wisconsin, have that split legislature governor variance, but the chief state school officer is directly elected. And then Kansas and Kentucky are the other two. And their state board makes the appointment rather than the governor. So it is a relatively unique position that y'all are in.
Yeah, and I'll just say, when the position shifted, it is much less partisan political here, because it was under a Democratic governor where it shifted, and now it's under a Republican governor, and the legislative leadership has been Democratic throughout that whole time. So I'll just say that it's less partisan politics, but more power at the executive level is what I'm trying to get at.
Right. And I think that's something that Zeke mentioned Ohio just this past year through an initiative of their Republican-led legislature, consolidated many of the powers of the State Department underneath the governor's office in that new Office of Education and Workforce, which is led by a cabinet level member there. They interestingly led a session at our national forum this past summer that shared their experience and process in that. And, they, based on some questions from the attendees, acknowledge, of course, that it is a consolidation of power, and that in a state like Ohio, where it's very often more purple in their voting patterns, the shoe could be on the other foot in the near future. So it's just I guess, a matter of priorities and where you all as policymakers would like authority to lie within the government.
Right, and stability, because our governor is elected every 2 years.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to note how many, where it's a governor-appointed position, are 2-year governorships.
Yeah, it would be.
Great. Thank you, and thank you for perhaps providing us with a new state motto, Vermont, relatively unique. Anything else? Anything else from Senate Education?
No,
Great.
yeah, so no, thank you.
All right, thanks for joining us, and thanks to the folks at ECS for your insight as always. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And to our friends in the Senate Education Room, I'll see you about this time tomorrow.
Okay, good.
Sounds good.
Thanks for having
Bye,
us.
y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we will take 10 minutes and we're back here at 2.
Okay.